Hello and welcome to Immediate Immersion Live. Today we're going to be talking about how to make your textbook more comprehensible, input friendly. If you're new to us, please type in the comments #newbie. If you've been here a while, type in #returnee. Also like to know where you're watching from. And if you're going to be watching this on the replay, please add your things to the comments as well. I do check back frequently. So, my name is Scott, and you're watching Immediate Immersion Live, where we're all about teaching with comprehension-based input in the modern language classroom. And we'll be right back after this short intro. Hello and welcome back. So today we are going to be talking about how to take that textbook and make it more comprehension based. I haven't had to use a textbook for many years. I only had to use it in my first 4 years of teaching, and I found ways to make my textbook more comprehensible and didn't use as much of the textbook as my colleagues would have wanted. But my kids still did all the common assessments that we had that were straight from the textbook. And they did just as well as the students who were taught with the textbook, straight from the textbook, in the grammar sections, but excelled really well listening, reading, writing, and speaking. In fact, in the school that I was teaching at, where we were required to use the textbook, we were using Ya Verás for my first year, and then we moved over to Realidades. I'm sorry, not Realidades. That was the newer one, the new version. Paso a Paso, which was the predecessor of Realidades, is what we taught with. Paso a Paso did have a TPRS supplement written by Karen Rowan, and I did use a lot of that stuff to start me off when we had that. But as I was saying, the school that I was teaching at, where we did have the textbook, they never wanted to do the speaking part. They always said it took too long, and it was always problematic because it took too long and the kids never did well at it. Well, they never did well at it because you focused on a textbook, which is like teaching kids all the parts of a car for driver's ed and not teaching them actually how to drive the car. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and I have this into 5 different sections that we can talk about. If you have any ideas, questions, or comments, please do drop them into the comments. It's very helpful if you have any questions so we can engage. And as I said, if you're watching this in the replay, you're welcome to also put things in the comments because I can check them out afterwards and answer you. So let's go ahead and get started with the vocabulary. Let me tell you, first of all, you probably already know there is way too much vocabulary inside of a textbook. The average textbook has about 75 to 100 words per chapter. That's ridiculous. And most schools require you to teach 12 to 15 chapters. That's 1,200 to 1,500 vocabulary words. And the worst part about the words is most of them aren't even useful. There is a section, no matter what series of textbook that you use, there is a section that goes over every single element of the classroom, from thumbtacks to paper clips to staples. These things are not high-frequency vocabulary. They are vocabulary that is kind of common in the classroom, but I still don't have kids asking for paper clips very often. It's just not a very useful word, and once they're out of school, they'll probably never need that word. Yet, they're required to remember it, to be tested on it. It's in vocabulary tests, it's in the listenings and the readings, and all of that. So much of the vocabulary can be flushed out because it's just not high frequency. When They took paso a paso and turned it into realidades. They took away some of that extra vocabulary, but not nearly enough of it. I remember when I was teaching paso a paso, chapter 5 of the Spanish 2 book was teaching the imperfect. So they were using childhood memories. And there's the whole playground equipment. Teeter-totter, slide, swings, merry-go-round, all those words. Definitely not high frequency. I was teaching at a time in a predominantly Chinese Asian school where most of the kids, English was their second language. And I had to try to explain what a teeter-totter was. This was before there was YouTube. And most places have removed teeter-totters out of the playground because they were dangerous. So try to explain this word that they had to learn and memorize for the test, yet it wasn't applicable to their lives at all. So there's a lot of that vocabulary. So here's what I suggest you do for the vocabulary. I would use a frequency dictionary. And I'm going to type the first part of the title in there. In the chat here, frequency dictionary of, and let me post that up there for you. So go to Amazon and type that in, frequency dictionary of, and then insert your language in there. It's not there for every single language, but it is there for most of the ones that are taught here in the United States. So you've got Arabic, Mandarin, Spanish, Portuguese, German, French. The common ones are all there. Latin is there, I believe, as well. And these are a great series of books. They are published by Routledge, I believe. Routledge Publishing. So to make sure you have the right ones. What I love about these is the way that they're organized. They're organized in two ways with some pop-ups within the pages. So first, the first half of the book is listing the top words in the language in numerical order. I think the German goes to top 2,000. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Spanish and French go to the top 5,000. And in Spanish, at least, the top 100 count for about 80% of spoken language. You can read the preface to find out how they came up with these numbers, but I will just summarize it quickly for you. They're using literature, regular like writing in modern times and newspapers. They're using movies, TV, and news places to gather all of the information from different registers, so from the rich to the poor, the educated to the uneducated, and they're compiling it all together to come up with a list in order. So you can find this order in there. Then, in the second half of the book, the words are in alphabetical order, so you can look up the word you're looking for and finding out where it stands in the list. Now, working with the average, in most languages, the working vocabulary, the vocabulary that comes out of people's mouths, is about 1,800 words. Now, they recognize and understand a lot more than that. I call this the reading vocabulary. But my active speaking vocabulary is around 1,800 words. And I promise you that's not including paperclip or stapler. So my goal is to teach the most common of these words over my period of 4 years. So go through your textbook vocabulary and cross off any vocabulary that is above the 2,000 mark. So look up your words. You can thank me later, but you wiped out a lot of chapters, like the food chapter. Almost all of that chapter is way too high. They don't use them very often. The words just aren't there. And the words that they do use often aren't in the list. But go through and cull your vocabulary. Go through every chapter. We did this even using a TPRS curriculum. We would go through and go, oh, that's a Mexicanism, so we don't really want to teach that. We're trying to teach more the whole language. We don't want something that's so regionalized in there. Or this word keeps repeating over and over and over again, but it's not really high frequency. Can be replaced with something else. Like I know cuervo, which is the word for crow. Not exactly high frequency. And I was teaching in Vegas, and they knew what a cuervo was because of the drink, the alcohol. So I didn't have to teach that word. So we just changed it to pájaro, which just means bird, which is just a little bit more generic, but a little bit more useful than cuervo. So we go through, you call the vocabulary. Anything over 2,000, all you want them to do is be able to recognize it. That's it. I don't actually require them to produce that. Anything within the first 2,000, I would like them to be able to produce. But you're going to wipe out most of the vocabulary right away. In fact, you might not even get to the top 2,000 words using all 3 years of a textbook series, level 1, level 2, and level 3. Because even though there's probably about 4,500 words in that list, most of them are above that 2,000 mark, and you can just wipe them out. So if it's under the 2,000 mark, then you want to teach it as active vocabulary. You want them to be able to produce that language. Anything 2,000 and over, just recognize it. It's passive vocabulary. They recognize it when they hear it or when they see it, but they're not going to remember it to produce it. So that's how I work with that. So that's one way. First of all, call that vocabulary out. I also don't recommend giving out of context vocabulary quizzes. In real life, we never experience vocabulary or words in lists. There's always context. The words are always within a sentence or a paragraph. And that's how we should assess vocabulary. If I want to assess if a student knows this word passively, meaning they can understand it, I am going to put it into a listening or a reading text and then ask questions that tell me, do they understand what that word means? If I want them to demonstrate they can produce that word, I am going to include it in a writing or a speaking prompt. So in order to be successful, they'll have to use that word in writing or in speaking. That's how I assess vocabulary. Next, let's go on into grammar. So there's a ton of grammar in a textbook. And it's always taught out of context again. And we just don't experience the world, language, out of context. None of us learned the grammar rules from our own language from the rules themselves. We learned the language, and once we were fluent in the language, then school started introducing the rules to perfect our language, to fix our mistakes. But the rules did not come first. The language came first, and then the rules came afterwards to polish everything up. In language, in current practices, the rules come first before the language, and that just doesn't work very well. Again, that's like teaching a kid how to put together a car, but not actually showing them how to drive it. So, what do I recommend for grammar? I would go through your whole textbook and find the big strokes of grammar that the book is trying to teach. For level 1, I would say the biggest stroke usually is the present tense. Now, I don't break it down into the present tense of regular verbs and the present tense of irregular verbs and the present tense of stem changing verbs. I don't bother with that. It's just the present tense of verbs. And there might be some other things, like in Spanish, you're going to have basic word order, like adjectives come after the nouns they describe, and that adjectives must match the gender of the noun. Those types of things. I will tell you gender and adjective agreement come late in language acquisition, even for native speakers, so I wouldn't harp on it. I would demonstrate it, show it how it's done in context through speaking and reading, and then the kids will eventually start to pick it up and they'll pick it up badly for the first few years, especially if their native language is English, where we no longer have gender or adjective agreement. So that's where I would start with that. Find the big strokes. Another example would be in Spanish, there's this, there's that, and there's that other one that's far away. We have este, ese, y aquel. I don't teach aquel because aquel is a cultural word. Some people think aquel refers to something on the other end of the room, and some on the other end of town, and some on the other end of the state. It's kind of relative to the person and what they believe aquel means. My kids don't need it to be able to actually communicate in the language. It's a nice to have, but not a need to have. So will I be teaching this and that? Absolutely. And then aquel will be a word they recognize. And if they live in a country, they'll pick up how that country uses that word in a more natural way. But I'm not going to focus on it. It's minutia. It's the same thing for a lot of other things in the grammar book. So look through, find the big, broad strokes of grammar, and that's what you want to focus on. Every level 1 book for a language that has gender will focus on gender of nouns and adjective agreement. You want to model the correctness of this and even mention it from time to time, but I would never assess for it because it is small in the scope of things. It's something that's late acquired even for native speakers, and it doesn't change the meaning of the word. So if they use the wrong gender, the wrong the wrong article with the noun, it still means what it means. It doesn't change what it means. If they don't have the adjective agree properly with the noun, again, it doesn't change what it means. It sounds funny to a native speaker, but nobody's going to get mixed up with what you're trying to say. If you say, la perro, nobody cares. It still means the dog. We know it's correctly el perro, but it doesn't matter. The understanding is still there. So focus on the grammar. That's the big strokes in your textbook, not on all the minutia. So go through with your team, go through, make a list of all the grammar in the book, and then decide what are the broad strokes. What are you going to focus on for that level? The other stuff can be exposed. I want to expose my kids to direct and indirect objects starting on day 1 of Spanish 1. I'm not assessing it then. I'll assess it later on, like in level 2, but I want them to hear it. I don't want them to all of a sudden say, where did this come from? I never heard this before. Same thing with the subjunctive for languages that have it. Expose early, assess later. You have to use the subjunctive so they get familiar with it. I always switch out how I'm asking kids to do things. So I might be saying, okay, I want that you guys take out your books, which produces the subjunctive in Spanish and French. Other times I'll just say, take out your books, which is the imperative, which also uses the subjunctive. But I want to keep it back and forth. It's necessary that everyone put away their phones. Again, causes subjunctive. So my kids hear it and are exposed to it, but never assessed on it so early. So that's how I deal with vocabulary and grammar. If there are any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. While you're doing that, I am going to move on into, if I can click my buttons properly, to creating stories. So creating stories is what we do in comprehension-based classrooms. I guess we can remove the frequency dictionary here. And this is where we're going to personalize what we do, what's in the textbook, to our students. So I am going to co-create stories with the high frequency vocabulary from that chapter and the broad stroke grammar focus of that level with my students. We're going to bring in actors. We're going to do all of that part with the stories. And depending on how many vocabulary items are left after you culled the vocabulary for the chapter, that's going to determine how many oral stories that you need. Generally, I would not put more than 3 to 5 new vocabulary words into a story that you're trying to teach. 3 is a good number. Sometimes you can go to 5 if the words are relatively easy, or if some of the words are somewhat familiar. But for completely brand new words that are very different from each other, I would stick with 3. And I'm going to create stories. So we're going to do co-creating a story in the class with my students. I'm going to write down my target vocabulary for myself because I know I need to work these words in to my story, but I'm going to have it organically be created with my students. That's how I do it. Other people might prefer or might feel safer having a pre-written script out there, and that's fine. If you go the script route, you'll script out your story. The vocabulary that you're working with, the sentences that have that vocabulary, you boldface those so that you know these are really important and they can't change because these are the targets. This is what you're trying to teach. Then the other sentences are in regular face, but I will underline any parts of the story that can change. So let's say a typical story starts off, there is a boy. Well, boy can be underlined. I'm teaching one of my first structures I teach is there is. So there is bolded, so I know I need to focus on that. But boy, I don't care. I don't care what there is. So I will underline it. And instead of reading straight from my script right off the start, I will start with class going, class, what's our character? Is it a person? Is it an animal? Or is it a thing? And once we get narrowed down to what it is, let's say it's a cell phone. That's going to be our character. I know mentally now that everywhere that word boy with the underline is in my story, I'm going to replace that with a cell phone. Same thing with descriptions. I may have already written a sentence with descriptions of what this boy looks like, but now we got a cell phone, and so I'm going to replace those descriptions with the descriptions my kids come up with describing this cell phone. So that's how you use your students' ideas along with your script to make a story with your class. So it looks like it's their story, and it's your skeleton with their ideas mixed together. So that's how you would do that. And again, with the bold parts, those are the parts that you're really focusing on teaching, those stay the same, and you really want to make sure that you are repeating these, that you're asking tons of questions about these parts so that they can get the patterns in their head. And then with each of these oral stories that you've done that you're going to act out with your class, you're going to write text stories, so text-based stories using the same structures, the same vocabulary, but not necessarily the same story. I know some people like to see the oral story written down. But in my experience, my students never liked that. They said, we just did this story yesterday. Why are we reading it now? So I like to do a different story with the same targets. And then I make sure I put my students from my classes in the story. And that works well for me. So whichever way works for you, that's great. My only concern is when you do an oral story and then the written story is just a longer version of that same story. Oftentimes, students and even sometimes teachers think the goal of that lesson is to memorize the story. And that's never the point. The story is the vehicle to get somewhere. But what is important is that they got there, so that they acquire these targets, and the patterns that were in those stories is the goal. And it's similar to if you're going to have a family vacation someplace, and some people fly there, and some people drive there, and some people took a train. It doesn't matter how you get there. It just matters that everybody got there. And that's the same thing with these stories. So the point never is the story itself. I never assess the story itself. I'm assessing in a different context if they acquired the patterns and the vocabulary that I was trying to teach in those stories. Don't see any questions popping up, but if you have any questions, please, or comments, please put them in the chat. So that's that third piece there. You're going to take the vocabulary that you've culled and the grammar that you've culled, and you are going to create stories that present that vocabulary and grammar in context that your students can engage with. Both oral stories so they can hear and understand, and written stories so they can read and understand. And you'll write as many of these as needed to teach all of the grammar and all of the vocabulary. Next, we're going to actually now go back to the textbook. And we're going to now use some of the activities. I would never, ever assign the grammar activities from a textbook. They're just not helpful for most students. The types of activities that I would work on are the listening, reading, and cultural activities in the book. So if there are oral activities where they listen and they answer questions, or texts that they'll read in the book and then answer questions about, and cultural entries in the book, those I would use from the book. Those are helpful in the book, and they prepare them for the test that comes from the book at the end. So do those just like the book prescribes. You're going to use the listening, the reading, and the culture. You're going to stay away from the grammar, though. Stay away from the grammar and just focus on listening, reading, and the culture. If you can find ways to make these more engaging or interesting, do so. Play some games with some of this stuff, because usually the stuff in the textbook is quite dry. Also, the readings are usually about some third person that nobody cares about. And so find ways to engage students in the readings. One successful strategy is what Blaine Ray calls a parallel character. So because the story is not about our students, and we want to make the story related to our students, we're going to constantly compare the characters in the story with our kids in class. So let's just say, for example, you're reading a story in the food chapter of level 1, and it talks about Maria, and she's going to a Mexican restaurant. So then you start asking to your class, so you can bring the students into the text a little bit. Who has gone to a Mexican restaurant? Who likes Mexican food? Who goes to the Mexican restaurant often? What's your favorite Mexican food at the restaurant? Those types of questions. And then go back to the story. Whatever the character does in the story, ask if anybody else has done that, eaten that, tasted that, whatever. Find a way to relate the text in the book to your students so that they're more engaged with it. And that's how you can use those activities. The cultural activities are usually probably the best parts of a textbook. So use those to have good discussions. So usually they introduce it through a reading, and you read about some cultural aspect, but then expand upon that. Create some lessons where you can have a conversation with your students about this cultural activity or cultural aspect. Compare and contrast it with the local customs and local culture. Find YouTube videos that also talk about this culture that you can do. Use Google Maps to show where in the world that this culture is done and experienced, and you can explore it through Google Maps, through YouTube, and through class discussions, which are so important. So that's using the book's activities. And last, let's talk about using the prompts from the book. Now, the prompts are usually pretty dry, and the prompts, I'm talking the writing and the speaking prompts. So you want to use these because these are directly related to the assessment that's going to come at the end of the chapter. So you want to use these. You want to find ways to make them more interesting and more personal to your students. So in any way that you can slightly change the prompt without really changing it too much and making it more geared to the students in your class, it will be more successful that way. But you also want to augment these prompts with your own prompts. So in a comprehension-based classroom, we do weekly quick writes. And so, yes, you want to have the students do the ones that are in the textbook, but you also want to include ones that you come up with so that they get some other additional practice. Same thing with some speaking prompts. Also recognize that in comprehension-based classrooms, we don't want kids necessarily always talking to each other all the time. We want to limit that. Why? Because kids pick up bad habits. So if this kid is speaking improperly and this kid's listening, this kid might pick up some of the bad speaking habits of this kid. We know this happens in real life. I can give you 2 examples. Twins, when they are in the crib together, they come up with their own language that only they understand because they're parroting off of each other. The rest of us don't understand it. And 2, kids learn the proper grammar from their parents and their friends, not from teachers. I can tell my students until I'm blue in the face that it's not Johnny and me or me and Johnny, it's Johnny and I, but they do it all the time. Or I did good on my test today. No, you did well on your test today. And if you look at kids who are second language English learners, they say them incorrectly as well, but in their native language they don't. For example, my experiences with Spanish, I will have native Spanish kids who know the difference between bueno and bien. And they'll say, hice bien en el examen, I did well on the test. But in English, they say, I did good. And I'll ask them, what's the word for good in English? In Spanish, they say bueno. What's the word for well? Bien. So then why did you switch from well in Spanish to good in English when they're not the same thing? They can't answer me. I already know the answer. It's because they hear the American kids saying, I did good, I did good, I did good all day long. So we want to limit that exposure to having the kids have all these conversations with each other. And some textbooks really emphasize this, so you want to downplay some of that so they don't pick up the bad habits. An example I had in my class is I had a kid who had it okay down, the backwards verbs, the me gusta, te gusta, etc. But the other kid still was saying, yo gusto, tú gustas, él gusta, conjugating it the normal way. My other kid thought the other kid's way was right and picked up that from listening to them. So I always try to limit how many talking prompts that they have. Usually, I do it only in retells, and I'll have each kid retell the same part of the story at the same time over top of each other, so nobody's listening to what's saying. And this way, if they don't have confidence, they don't have to worry because no one's listening to them. And it's just building some confidence to say, yeah, I did it and I can do it. But they're not listening to each other, so not picking up any bad habits. So those are my 5 areas on how I would take what my textbook gives me and make it more comprehensible and more comprehension-based for a CI classroom. Does anybody have any questions or comments or other ideas that you might use? And again, if you're watching on the replay, you're welcome to add them in. And I will check back. I'll give you a moment to think about that as I finish out here. If you found this information helpful, please like and subscribe because it does help us to get this information out to more teachers. I will see you next week, same time, same channel, Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific time. And watch out on Wednesday at 7 a.m. Pacific time where we'll release another video on YouTube that you can watch and learn from. So with that, I don't see any more comments or questions. Again, thank you all for being here this evening, and I will see you next week.